All right, let me get us started. So I'm glad to welcome you, friends, to our third part of our Lewis Preaching Series 2026. I hope that you were all safe and were able to enjoy some of the 14 to 17 inches of colossal snow that we received. I myself felt like I was back home in Michigan. Got to go sledding today. So this morning in Sunday school, we got to learn about the mixed reception that Esther has received from both Judaism and Christianity, and got to wonder about why it has found its place into our canonical scriptures nevertheless. At 11 o'clock in worship this morning, we got to hear about Queen Vashti, the sort of forerunner of Esther, and we got to hear about her refusal to dance at this long 186-day party put on by the king. And today, we're going to continue and hear about Esther in America. Before I introduce our speaker, I again want to thank the folks who have made this event possible. Thank you to Sarah Cook, Leanna Hoskins, Judy Mabe, Andrea Bullock, Leslie Dry, and Renee Bradshaw for all that you did in making this possible. I also want to recognize, and I heard his voice, so I know he is on the Zoom, the Reverend Dr. Bob Lewis, who served, led, galvanized, and animated this church for 24 years. This series began in 2003, and it continues to echo Bob's voice into the hearts and minds of this community. So, Bob, thank you for your legacy, for your preaching life, and for your ministry with this congregation. I also want to mention another Bob. This year's Lewis Preaching Series honors Bob Cook. Bob Cook was a prime example, I think, of Paul's description of what is supposed to be the Christian attitude in life that's given to us by Christ. He looked to others above himself, and his legacy of that radical humility lingers with us today. So thank you, Bob, for who you were and for the lasting impact that you leave with those of us here. Our Lewis preacher this year is one of the most important voices in our denomination, Reverend Amos DeSasa. We thank him for bearing through this weather and traveling all the way from Dallas, Texas to meet us here. When Amos was a young boy, his family immigrated here from Ethiopia, residing in Columbia, South Carolina, where Amos grew up and eventually pastored and planted Downtown Church, which still exists in Columbia, a really creative worshiping community there. Reverend Amos is currently the senior pastor of First Presbyterian Dallas, where he's been since 2019. Amos has previously said that his spiritual life ebbs and flows. He meditates, he reads a lot, he tries to be aware of the movement of God's Spirit all day long, wherever he is, whether in the church or not in the church, whether in a crowded restaurant or wherever he is. He says, I hope I will continue to encounter God every day and all day, wherever I am. So I invite you to give Amos a virtual applause, and we'll invite him now. Thank you, Amos.
Thanks, man. It's good to be with you all again. I bring greetings to you all the way from Dallas, Texas, from the good people at the First Presbyterian Church of Dallas. So if you're ever in our parts, make sure to reach out to me, and love to host you and extend the same hospitality to you that you all have extended to me. It's good to be back here in the Carolinas. I went to divinity school not far from here in Winston-Salem, and of course, as Josh just said, I grew up in Columbia and served two churches there. So these are my parts, and came all the way back here, and then it snowed, and it doesn't look anything like the Carolinas that I remember. So thank you all for that. I appreciate it. I want to continue our exploration of Esther, and want to posit again that this is a weird book. It's the weirdest book in the Bible, I think, and it is a noisy and rambunctious response, I believe, to many of our prayers for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. All right, so that's quite a claim, and I'm going to try to defend that in this presentation today. So for those of you that were with us for the Sunday school lesson and or the sermon, you've got a little bit of an introduction to Esther. We've already walked through the narrative, that narrative world of Esther, its Persian settings, its colorful characters, the structure of reversal that frames, scaffolds the text. We also explored the theological tensions inherent in the book. As Josh said, I preached on Vashti, the queen who refused to dance. But I am guessing that some of you that are joining us tonight may not have been at the Sunday school. So I'm going to give you a really brief synopsis of the story so that you know what I'm talking about later on. So the book of Esther is set in the Persian Empire during the reign of King Ahasuerus, usually identified with Xerxes the First. Ahasuerus is the fictional king in Esther. Xerxes I, Xerxes the First, 486 to 465 BC he reigned. So the Persian Empire, a very real thing. It's not fictional. It's stretched all the way from India south to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, the largest empire the world had yet seen up to that point. So the Jewish community are living as exiles in Persia, and they're probably descendants of those that were exiled from Jerusalem a century later, century earlier. So that's where we are. This story comes to us in 6 movements. The first one is the queen who said no. That's chapter 1. As I said, King Ahasuerus throws this big 180-day event, this banquet to display his wealth. And on the final night, he's drunk, he's showing off to everybody, and he summons Queen Vashti to parade her beauty in front of all of his guests. She refuses. He is embarrassed and ashamed, and he's also enraged because of her disobedience. The king, in that moment, banishes her, and he begins a search for a new queen. So that is how the story of Esther begins. Chapter 2, the orphan becomes a queen. Esther, she's a young Jewish woman. She's raised by her cousin Mordecai. She is taken into the king's harem, his household. She wins his favor. She becomes the queen, but on Mordecai's instruction, she hides her Jewish identity from the king. Meanwhile, Mordecai, her cousin, uncovers an assassination plot against the king, and he reports it, but he does not receive a reward from the king for that. Then you move on to chapter 3, and this is when the horror, the terror really begins. In chapter 3, chapter 4, the king promotes a man by the name of Haman, who is a descendant of one of Israel's ancient enemies. And he promotes him to the highest position in the king's court. Haman is a proud man, and he's walking by Mordecai, Esther's cousin, one day, and all the men that are there in Haman's path bow down because of Haman's position. Mordecai refuses to bow down. Haman becomes enraged, and instead of punishing Mordecai and for his disobedience or for his refusal to bow, he convinces the king to issue an edict, an empire-wide edict, national edict, authorizing the annihilation of all the Jews in the empire on a single day because Mordecai is a Jew. So Mordecai hears about this. He sends word to Esther, and he tells her, you must intervene. We have no hope if not for you, because you are closest to the king. You're in a position to help. And it's there where we hear that famous challenge of Mordecai. Who knows, he says to Esther, perhaps you have come to royal dignity for a day or for a time such as this. So we move on to chapters 5 and 7. Esther risks her life there by approaching the king uninvited. You've got to be invited into the king's court or into the king's presence. Esther approaches the king uninvited. She invites him and Haman to a series of banquets. This king is always partying. We'll talk about that in just a second. Meanwhile, the king one night suffers insomnia. And that night, while he's suffering insomnia, he does what we all do. He goes and he picks up a boring book. He begins to read the royal chronicles of his own court. And while he's reading those royal chronicles, he discovers that Mordecai was never rewarded for saving his life. And he wonders, how could this happen? And so in a bit of delicious irony, Haman is forced to publicly honor the man that he despises. And so at the second banquet, the second big banquet in this book, Esther reveals her identity and she accuses Haman, and the king has Haman hanged on the very gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai. So this is the big reversal. At the end of the book, there is the story of the Jewish survival and the commencement of the Purim festival. So that original edict that the king issued, the annihilation of the Jews, it cannot be rescinded for some reason. This is one of the comedic tics of Esther. The bureaucracy seems to be vast, but it can't undo what it has already done. So the edict can't be rescinded. So the king has to issue a second edict, allowing the Jews to defend themselves. And so on the appointed day when all of the Jews were to be annihilated, they defeat their enemies, and the death toll is staggering. 75,000 across the empire. And the narrator of Esther seems to gloat in that number. And then you get the institution of Purim, a festival of memory and feasting and gift giving, in which Jewish communities still to this day read the whole scroll of the book of Esther. This is a strange story. And again, we've already talked about some of this earlier, but I'll just mention it again. What is very unique about Esther is that God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. No prayers, there's no prophets, there's no miracles. The second thing that's really interesting about Esther is it is objectively funny, laugh out loud funny. And then the heroes are morally ambiguous at best. Esther hides her identity. She marries a pagan king. She manipulates the king with her beauty. And she participates in some court intrigue. Finally, as I said earlier, the ending is bloody. And Esther does not apologize for it. The ending is unresolved. And we'll get into a little bit about that later. So I want to turn now that you've got this background for Esther, I want to turn to the contemporary resonance of it. The most uncomfortable question, if you read Esther, is what does this ancient story have to say to us today? So the answer that I want to suggest is that it has everything to say to us in this moment. The contemporary resonance of the Esther story is unmistakable. State power bears down to settle personal scores. Non-native residents are acutely vulnerable. God is silent throughout, hiding among coincidences or not. So we're not the first generation to recognize ourselves in Esther, and we will not be the last. History seems to keep repeating itself. So I want to begin by talking about the capriciousness of unchecked state power in Esther. In Esther, the entire apparatus of the Persian state, its couriers, its scribes, its governors, its translators, they all exist to execute the king's mood. So when the king is merry with wine at the beginning of Esther, he summons 7 advisors to go and fetch the queen so that he can show her off to his guests. When the queen won't come, he asks 7 advisors what should be done about her disobedience, and they convince him to banish the queen and issue a national decree reaffirming male dominance in every household. When his advisor Haman whispers in his ear about the Jews, he signs an order for genocide without asking a single question. This king never initiates evil on his own. He just fails again and again to resist it. So he is constitutionally incapable of an independent thought of his own. And he's also too lazy to question the motives of his advisors. His fragile ego is easily and frequently exploited. None of this is ancient history for us. The machinery of state violence rarely requires a singular evil genius. It does require, though, a leader who cannot be bothered to verify claims, advisors who leverage proximity to power to promote their personal agendas, bureaucracies that translate political fetishes into policies, and citizens who comply because compliance is always easier in the short term than resistance. I want you to notice Haman's playbook. Haman, as I said earlier, was the advisor to the king who had personal beef with Mordecai the Jew. And so instead of dealing with Mordecai individually, Haman goes and he tells the king, convinces the king to issue a decree calling for the erasure, complete annihilation of all the Jews that were living in Persia. This happens in a very narratively sophisticated and interesting point in the story. All right, and I'm giving you here the actual text. All right, so he begins, Haman, when he's building his case for ethnic cleansing to the king, he begins with the truth. All right, this is Esther chapter 3, verse 8, if you want to go and look this up. And he says, there is a certain people scattered and separated among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. That's the first thing he says to the king. Now, this is true, objectively true, factually true. The Jews are dispersed throughout Persia, but so are many other ethnic groups in this vast multicultural empire. Right? So he begins with the truth, softens up the king. Next comes the half-truth. And continuing in that verse, he says, their laws are different from those of every other people. So, this is a half-truth. They absolutely do have different customs. This is also true, but different is not the same as dangerous. Right? The other thing is, their rituals, their customs, their laws, they're not the same thing, right? So they do have different customs, but the customs and the laws, they are following the laws of the Persian Empire. There's been no evidence of this. And yet still he moves to the lie. And at the end he says, they do not keep the king's laws. Right? So there's no evidence of this in Esther at all. Mordecai, the Jew, has just saved the king's life. Esther, the Jew, has been the queen for years without any incident. This claim is invented to serve Haman's vendetta. And we see this pattern across history. You begin with an observable fact, and then you interpret the fact as a threat, and then you fabricate evidence of imminent danger just to accelerate a crisis. And then you mobilize state power to eliminate the threat. The Hebrew Bible scholar Michael Fox, who was a scholar on Esther, he wrote, it's easier to kill an abstraction than a person. And we know this to be the case. That's why they say things like Mexicans are illegals, Muslims are terrorists, Haitians eat pets. They also say things like Southerners are unrepentant racists. Republicans are white supremacists. The abstraction always precedes the violence. The label licenses the elimination. I'm from the South. Now that I've left the South, and I tell people where I'm from, the looks they give me, tell them my neighbors in the South we don't look at each other like that. You know, we're not as strange as you think we are. What Esther does so well is narrate to us the capture of the bureaucracy. So the easiest way to get rid of people is to write the abstraction into law, which in turn allows you to frame the erasure as law enforcement. Chinese migration, we can go back. This is many examples we could pull from, but I'll give you just one. Chinese migration to the United States, it began in significant numbers in the mid-19th century here. It was primarily driven by poverty, war instability in southern China. And many came seeking opportunity during the California Gold Rush, 1848 to 1855. Later, they found work building the Transcontinental Railroad, where they formed the backbone of the Central Pacific Railroad's labor force. And despite their essential contributions to local economies and their willingness to work low-wage jobs in restaurants and in laundromats, Chinese immigrants quickly became targets of lawmakers in California who passed state laws attempting to restrict their growth and their movement. And so to drum up support, remember Haman, to drum up support for a state-sponsored project of racial discrimination, you had politicians and labor leaders, and they argued these things. They said the Chinese are incapable of assimilating. They said the Chinese are undercutting the wages of real Americans. They refuse to adopt American culture. And they concentrate themselves in tight-knit enclaves that appeared impermeable and unwelcoming to anyone that was predisposed to believe that the Chinese were up to no good. So it wasn't long before California's hostility toward Chinese immigrants became a national issue. It blew up, and the xenophobic climate, it culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the very first major federal law to ban immigration based on nationality or race. So in 1882, the year that the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, the entire Chinese population totaled 105,000 people, or 0.2% of the total U.S. population. And that law suspended Chinese labor immigration. It denied citizenship to those that were already in the country, and it institutionalized a regime of surveillance and deportation and legalized repression. This pattern continues to repeat itself. One of the most chilling details in Esther is how ordinary the genocide just appears. The couriers went quickly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in the citadel of Susa, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. This is Esther chapter 3, Verse 15, the king signs the death warrant and then he goes out for drinks. This is the political theorist Hannah Arendt's banality of evil. The banality of evil is when the machinery of destruction operates while the architects enjoy their evening. And the paperwork gets filed, the translators do their jobs, the couriers deliver the message. Everyone is just as they say, following orders. And meanwhile, the city is thrown into confusion. This is an important moment in the narrative because this is the first time that the bureaucratic efficiency of the empire is met with something other than obsequious compliance. I see grace in this moment. You see, ordinary people, they read this decree and they put it aside bewildered. The narrator did not have to tell us the city was thrown into confusion, and yet the narrator did. So they're bewildered. A woman in the market, say, maybe remembers her Jewish neighbor. A scribe translating the edict finds his hand trembling while he's trying to write it. And this confusion is not impotence, right? It is the first crack in the lie. The grace then begins to gather up in the refusal to immediately comply. The narrator did not tell us they were afraid. He just said they were confused. Praise God for that. It is still hesitant and unsure of itself. Confused, as the text says. But for now, this is enough. I want to talk a little bit about the challenge of demanding purity from our heroes. And I'm doing this, I did this in the earlier lecture, but I'll do this again because we're going to move to a comparison of Reinhold Niebuhr's Christian realism and the story of Esther. But to get there, we have to really focus on the problem of Esther and Mordecai and the challenge of demanding purity from them. So this is the difficulty that made Martin Luther despise this book and made Christians uneasy for centuries as they read it. Esther and Mordecai are irreligious heroes. They are much more pragmatic than they are faithful. You can consider Esther. We've already gone through this. She marries a pagan king. She hides her Jewish identity for years. She sits at the king's table, lives in his harem, conceals her people. She finally acts, but when she does, it's not out of some religious conviction or some grand vision of the future. She just does it out of an instinct for survival. And then you got Mordecai, the other supposed hero. His refusal to bow down to Haman is never explained. And really, you could say, just bow to Haman. All your relatives, your people were almost annihilated because you wouldn't bow to him. Just bow down. Is it religious principle that kept him from bowing down, or is it some personal pride? We don't know. The story doesn't care to tell us. Mordecai instructs Esther to hide her identity, her religious, ethnic identity, the thing that makes her who she is. And then you've got that famous challenge of his. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Is it a question? It's not prophecy. He doesn't know either. He's just saying stuff. And then you consider the ending. You get to the ending, and the Jews are authorized to destroy, kill, and annihilate their enemies. In 2 days, they kill 75,000 people across them. They did not turn the other cheek. They didn't love their enemies. And the book records all this without apology, without any divine sanction, without any moral commentary. And this brings us to Reinhold Niebuhr. Niebuhr was an American theologian. He wrote, foremost probably, I would say, theologian of the 19th century, 20th century, sorry. He wrote a book in 1944, The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness. And I think this book offers us a framework for understanding Esther's moral complexity and finding some hope in it. Right? So Niebuhr borrows the title for this book from Jesus' parable in Luke chapter 16. The children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light, Jesus said. So there are two postures Niebuhr offers to us. He says, in this world we live in, some are children of light and some are children of darkness. Children of light believe in universal moral law beyond their self-interests. Children of light are optimistic generally about human nature and progress. Children of light trust that reason and goodness will ultimately prevail. Children of light also often underestimate the power of self-interest and the persistence of evil. In contrast to children of light, you've got children of darkness. These are modes of thinking or understanding the world, right? So children of darkness, they know only their self-interest as the ultimate law. Children of darkness are cynical, they're ruthless, they are strategically shrewd. And children of darkness understand power and are willing to use it without moral restraint. Right? So Niebuhr for a long time was a social pacifist. And then you get into World War II and Niebuhr was forced to rethink his pacifism and theorize and find some intellectual, like reasonable argument that he could make as a Christian to endorse the America's participation in World War II. This book came out of that wrestling for him. So here is Niebuhr's insight, the most important one. He said the children of light are often undone by their naivete. They assume that evil can be defeated by moral argument alone. They do not understand the tide of self-interest and power politics, that those must be resisted by power, not merely by rhetoric or procedures. So, democracy, Niebuhr argued, is necessary precisely because of human sinfulness. And he's got this famous formulation. Niebuhr said man's capacity, this was in the preface to the introduction to Children of Light and Children of Darkness. He said, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. So the question I want to ask you is, what if Esther is not a failure of biblical ethics, but an example of Niebuhrian realism? I think Mordecai and Esther are children of light that are forced to operate in a world that is ruled by children of darkness. And they realize that they cannot defeat Haman with moral purity or good arguments. The conclusion that they come to is that martyrdom is for the historians to fight over. It does no good here. In fact, they must be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves. So in this way, Esther, she uses her beauty and her position, tools that she did not choose, to gain access to power. Mordecai uses his intelligence, perfect timing, his proximity to the throne. They do not wait for God to intervene. They act with the tools that are available to them. And they do it in the ambiguity of diaspora existence. That's all they've got. So I want to make it clear that this is not moral license to do anything. That's not the argument that Niebuhr is making, neither is it my argument. It is moral realism. The book of Esther says sometimes survival requires cunning. Sometimes the only way to protect your people is to work within a system that you cannot overthrow. Sometimes what looks like complicity is necessary in order to eventually resist. So the question is not whether Esther and Mordecai were pure in their motives. The question is whether they remained faithful to their people. So here is the warning for us. When we demand moral purity from our heroes, we often end up with no heroes at all. Or worse, we become paralyzed and unable to act because no action is clean. Niebuhr warned against what he called moral man and immoral society, which is the gap between individual ethics and collective action. In the political realm, there are no purely good options. Every choice involves a compromise. There are unintended consequences, and there are complicity with systems that we did not create. The children of light who refuse to engage with power on those terms often surrender the field to the children of darkness. So Esther, I would say, did not surrender the field. She enters the throne room knowing that she might die because she approached the king uninvited. She acts without certainty about how it's going to end, without any divine guarantee or divine instruction, without moral perfection, and her people survive. So the last thing I'll say, and this I think is why Esther's story is to me, the most resonant part of Esther's story is the fact that it ends and almost nothing changes. There is a limit to Esther's victory. If you are looking for some like model for, the deconstruction of, systemic evil, do not go to Esther for that. It's not there. Haman is hanged in the gallows that he built for Mordecai, and the edict of destruction is reversed. The Jews are saved, but nothing fundamental changes. Nothing. The king is still a buffoon. The empire is still capricious. The system that allowed one man's vendetta to become state policy is still intact. It can happen again. That decree of genocide, once it is issued, could not be rescinded. It could only be countered with a second decree authorizing self-defense. The best Esther could do was have violence cover up violence. The book of Esther does not end with liberation. It ends with survival and with the institution of a festival to remember that survival. The inadequacy of final solutions is a pattern that has repeated itself. You go to East Timor, 1999. Independence is won there, and the crowds filled the streets, but the generals who oversaw the massacre, they are never tried. And they live freely. Some are still in politics. Survivors, the ones that rebuild on scorched soil. India, 1950. The caste system is outlawed. The Constitution outlaws the oppression, but Dalit activists to this day still march under banners that read, "We are human too." The law changed. The system persisted. You go to Colombia, 2016. There's a peace accord there. It ends 50 years of civil war. And FARC leaders disarm. The president wins a Nobel Prize. But in the countryside, the paramilitaries still control the land. and hundreds of community organizers have been killed since the signing of that peace agreement. South Africa, 1994. Apartheid ends that year. Mandela is elected. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission brings testimony into the light with the economic structures of apartheid. Who owns the land, who holds the capital, remain largely unchanged. The Hamans may hang, but the system that created Hamans endures. Liberation of people without transformation of the system is incomplete. I think Niebuhr understood this. Niebuhr understood the limits of politics. Niebuhr was deeply skeptical of any vision that promised final resolution of political conflicts. Niebuhr was against utopian progressivism. He rejected the idea that history bends inevitably toward justice. Progress is not automatic. It requires struggle, and gains can always be reversed. Niebuhr was against revolutionary idealism. He warned that those who promise to overthrow corrupt systems often reproduce the same corruption in new forms. The children of light who seize power often become, eventually, children of darkness. Niebuhr was also against cynical despair. And this is, you would think, like, how did he come to this conclusion after what I just said about him earlier? He refused nihilism. He would not go there. The fact that perfect justice is impossible, something that he admitted, does not mean that relative justice is worthless. So we can make things better without making them perfect. Niebuhr called this Christian realism. It is a politics that takes sin seriously without surrendering to it, and that works for justice without expecting utopia, and that remains engaged without illusions. I commend it to you. Esther's realism, I think this is the posture of Esther and Mordecai. I think they would have gotten along with Niebuhr really well. They do not transform the Persian Empire. They don't convert the king to Judaism. They don't establish a just society. What they do is survive, and they ensure that their people remember. And they say in Esther chapter 9, I think these words are for us as well. These days that we are living through should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every family, province and city. And these days of Purim shall never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. You see, the book of Esther does not promise that the threat is over. It promises only that memory will endure. And memory itself is a form of resistance. Where are we in this story? This is the uncomfortable question for American Christians today. Where do we locate ourselves in this Esther narrative? As I said earlier, for most of American history, the church has been aligned with power, not scattered and separated like the Jews in Persia, but we are established and comfortable here in North America. We actually have more in common with the Persians than we do with the Jews of Susa. But I think that is changing. The cultural position of the church is shifting. And in some respects, I think we are learning what it means to be exiles, to operate without the assumption that the state will protect our interests and protect the interests of marginalized people. Perhaps this is why Esther speaks to us now with some fresh urgency. And I'll leave you with this. I will never argue that Esther is a manual, right, for overthrowing abhorrent, unjust systems. It does not give us a political program. It really does not even give us much inspiration. It just keeps asking us questions. So I think these are the questions that Esther asks us. Where is Haman hiding in plain sight? Ask yourself, who is building a case for exclusion based on half-truths? Who's leveraging power for personal vendettas and disguising all of it as public policy? Where is Vashti needed? Let's not forget about her. Who must say no, to refuse to dance for the spectacle of power, even if the refusal seems ineffective and we never hear from that person who wouldn't dance again? Where is Esther's silence strategic? When is it wise to hide one's identity, and to work within the system, to wait for the right moment? And at what point does silence become complicity? What are we willing to risk? When is it wise? Esther's entrance into that throne room was never guaranteed to succeed when she went to the king. What she said was, before she went in there, she said, if I perish, I perish. So what cause would lead us to say the same? And finally, how are we remembering? And I think this is important. Perhaps most important for us, and maybe we should start here, by asking ourselves, what stories do we tell? What stories will we tell to ensure that our children know what happened and what it took to survive? The hope of Esther is not triumphalist. It does not promise that righteousness will always prevail, that the empires will crumble, that justice will roll down like waters in our lifetime. I want to offer to you that the hope of Esther is much smaller but more stubborn than all that. It is hope that notices it is alive. And it says, I am still here. You are still here. Despite the edicts, despite the machinery of death, despite the silence of God, the people survived, the story was told, and the festival was kept. And that is enough for today, because survival is always the highest good. Not because survival is the highest good, but because survival resists annihilation. To survive is to say the end has not come. The story is not finished. The last word has not been spoken, and you will not speak it. Back to Niebuhr again. Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime, he said. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. And so we read Esther not as an ancient history, but as a mirror that is pointed to us, and we read it knowing that the king is still a fool, and that Haman's descendants still walk the halls of power, and that the edict can be issued again at any moment. And we read it knowing that sometimes it may appear that God is silent, and that our heroes aren't perfect, and that our victories are partial. But we also read it knowing that we're still here, to remember, to resist, and to finish the story, and to trust that the hidden God is at work in all that confusion. So may it be so. Thank you. And I think y'all might have some questions. So
Yes, thank you, Reverend DeSasa, for your reflections, all three of them, and the way they've built to this one this evening. I want to invite anyone, if they've got a question, to raise their hand or put it in the chat. And if not, I'll ask one. I'll get us started. So you had a great quote. Well, let me first ask about children of light and children of darkness. Forgive me, I'm not the sharpest on Niebuhr. So where does he map being a confessional Christian onto that? Are Christians all children of light? Can we be children of darkness? How does he see confessing Jesus as Lord as part of that um,
Yeah,
setup?
I think Niebuhr would say the formulation, that framework of children of light and children of darkness, is not intended to be a theological statement. It's intended to be a framework by which to understand or to help Christians think about how to and it is with some theological or confessional threshold.
We cut out for a second.
Oh.
I'm so sorry. We didn't hear most of your answer, but we'd love to hear it
Let's see.
still.
Can I switch laptops here and we'll just do it from here? Is that all right, everyone?
Yep.
Can you hear
Well-
Laura? Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Good to see y'all's faces.
So we missed your answer. Would you say it again?
Yeah, I would say that Niebuhr would never have answered the question that you asked, because that framework, that dialectic, children of light, children of darkness, never intended to be a measure of some kind of like confession. It's not a threshold by which we measure a confession, but it's really a way to understand how Christians should relate to power and all politics. So. I would say there are professing Christians that Niebuhr would, and he did. He actually, if you read the book, he goes through and he actually has some real life examples. He calls some people children of darkness and some children of light, and he's much harder on the real. I mean the discovery of that book and is really his exploration of the children of light and their naivete. The children of darkness are typically obvious, but the children of light, if you've got to. He wrote that book for really, it was intended in many respects to be a response to all the pacifists at that time who were very, very anti-war and resisting the U.S.'s involvement in World War II on the grounds of pacifism and religious resistance to that on religious grounds as well. So,
Thank you. I see a hand raised from Barry and Kathy saying,
Can you hear me?
yes.
Yes. This is not as much a question, forgive me, as it is a celebration of what I think are some incredibly insightful remarks regarding Niebuhr and also the heroes of both testaments. I mean, Abraham was no purist by any means. Moses wanted to get out of the job. I mean, left and right. Peter, and that works really well with Niebuhr and also with Abigail Adams.
Right.
Because this notion that we have to be pristine in order for God to use us, I think doesn't fit with history at all. And that it also with Niebuhr too. One of my favorite phrases from Reinhold Niebuhr is this notion that we should seek approximations of justice. The justice is always an ideal. In a social context, just as love is an ideal within interpersonal relations, that socially justice is as close as we can get to love on a group thing. But even then, because we are sinful people, like Abigail was trying to remind John, that in democracy, the majority could be evil because we are people who have feet of clay. But that in all these cases, I mean, the democracy is it's better system. But we are still feet of clay, and we need to be constantly reminded that even in the midst of our confession of our sinfulness, God can still use us. Thank God.
You.
Thanks, Barry. Any response to that, Amos?
No, I would say, I mean, I didn't include this, but continuing on what our friend just said, I think Niebuhr was always regretful about the slow erosion of the theological uh, um, uh, um, uh, truth that was brought forth to us through the Puritans and Reformers of moral depravity, and and it can be helpful to us. I know we want, to believe that we're 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 innocent as doves, and it's that this world has just ruined us as people, and if we fix all the systems, then it will fix all the people.
Mm,
But it can be really, I think, illuminating, clarifying, if we just accept how depraved and Niebuhr's focus was on pride and the sin of pride, and how deep and permanent that was. And if it's helped me, as I mean, to be able to claim that and still hold on to some hope. It's not like, most of us think, well, if we get into start sounding like John Calvin, then we might end up, like curmudgeons like John Calvin. I don't think, like, there are some things from Calvin we just want to dismiss. I wish we would hold on to this notion of moral depravity. So
Mm.
I think it would be helpful to us in this moment, especially in this moment. We just I think we'd be kinder, gentler to each other. And we might be able to offer just some forbearance. And we might learn to be a little bit more compassionate and to stop expecting purity in action. Just stop doing it, and then we wouldn't be disappointed all the time. So anyway, yeah.
Thank you. I saw applause happening while you were talking about depravity. Um, Anyone else? Looking through. I've got one more question and then we'll let you uh, be free of all of our question asking. Where do you see, and this is not Esther, and so it might not even be a question that's connecting, but I still want to ask it. Where do you see the cross connecting with all of this?
Mm. Yeah, I go back to that moment, when Esther is she has received the instructions or the encouragement from Mordecai to intervene, and Mordecai is speculating, and he says, "Who knows?" Which I think those two words, "Who knows?" You could write a whole commentary just on those two words. Um, and he says, perhaps, you've come into power for just such a time as this. And her response in that moment, she does choose to go into the king's court, into his chambers, uninvited. She has to do that because she's not going to get the kind of invitation she needs. And what she does is that she presents herself kind of in such a way the king's going to notice her from a distance, and then she shows up. But you know what she says is, "If I perish, I perish." This is the theology of the cross that was really exemplified by Luther first, and really in many respects we've and by Jesus, which I think is very synonymous with the gospel, the essence of the gospel, which is, if you want to save your life, you must lose it. So we see the cross, the redemptive value, the redemptive purpose of the cross, and we jump to that often. But the redemption only comes through death and the absence of life, and the real physical, tactile, substantial and material suffering that was endured in that moment. And it wasn't done as punishment or consequence. This is what makes the cross the cross. It was endured, and Jesus took it upon himself. And perhaps in that moment, when Pilate accuses Jesus and asks Jesus to make a defense of himself, and what does Jesus say? I mean, he doesn't defend himself because he understands power. He knows it's like the state is going to do this no matter what. They have to do it. So I do think um, there is Esther, if she failed in that moment, she would have died in the same way. And see, this is what we know. We only know this because Vashti disobeyed and she was banished. We never heard from her again. Right? So the theology of the cross is an invitation to humiliation, public humiliation. Are we willing to take that on? Are we willing to endure that? Erasure, self-erasure, which is what the cross is, right? It's an erasure of self, public humiliation. So yeah, Esther, all that was on the line for Esther. So yeah, I see it there. I don't want to read the cross into Esther. This is a problem that evangelicals have. They're always trying to, like find, Jesus in every single psalm and every single, book of the Bible. And, there is nothing to suggest that the narrator of Esther, had any, prophetic tendencies at all. So yeah, but nonetheless, we're bringing our hermeneutic, our Christian sensibility. Of course, we're going to try to read, that in there. It's there. I think it's there. Absolutely.
Yeah. I just got a text that Josh has one last question for you.
Oh, okay.
The mics aren't working anymore, so I'll ask it from here. Hey, everybody. Hello. Amos, that was wonderful. My question is zooming out a little bit more so it's not as Esther specific, but since we have you here, since you're someone who's pastoring within our denomination, months ago, you sent me a newsletter that you wrote to your church, sort of looking out at the big picture of our denomination and our church, the way the world is. And so my question for you is, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges facing the church right now that may completely align with what you're talking about, but also just in general? And then how do you see churches, your own context or other churches meeting those challenges and being the church in 2026? It's a big question, but
Yeah. I don't know. Who knows? I should say, in the spirit of Mordecai. Yeah, I think there are the challenges of the church. I think the first one is perhaps we need to. I embrace the local nature of each one of our parishes, and so and really churches I've always believed they should reflect the communities and the people that are gathered in the communities that they are born in and they live in. And so I, in some respects, Josh, I reject the premise of your question in some respects, so um, um, yeah, I think that's one thing. I think it would be helpful for churches as well to stop confusing themselves with God and stop idolizing themselves and inviting their congregations to idolize their churches, the stories of their churches, the legacy of their churches, the history of their churches. Churches have been dying forever. They just have. This is the nature of, living organisms. They're born, they flourish, they age, and then they pass away. And I think every church gets to a point where it just cannot possibly imagine what the world would do without it, and I think that's a very unhealthy, and it just leads to some really bad. Churches tend to make bad decisions when they begin to I think when they begin to think they're special, and that God needs them. So I wish we would relieve ourselves of that pressure. And I think we would find hopefully some space for some creative and novel ways to represent glimpses of the kingdom of God to our local communities and the people that are gathered. So that's one. I also think, that we need small churches that are thriving. We absolutely do. So we got to figure out a way to honor small churches. Like every church doesn't have to be big and growing for it to be a faithful church. So that's another thing. But I also think what y'all are doing here is really important. I just want to say that I respect, I'm inspired by your willingness to listen to new voices and to introduce strangers into your community and to take time to listen to them. So churches can be, mildly insular, to put it, at best, and so it's good. I appreciate it. And keep doing that is what I would say. Keep talking to people, and please continue to be willing to change your mind. So, I think this is this is where it's going to be important. I think to keep. Are you open to being surprised, or do you already know? Do you already know everything, or are you open to being surprised? And almost every church chooses one of those responses, and then everything falls out from there. So, so I would just say be judicious and clear about which one you're choosing, and then orient your life together around that choice. Yeah. Thank y'all. Yep. Bless y'all. Hopefully I'll meet all of y'all in person one day. So if you come to Dallas, call me, please.
Well, Amos, I just want to thank you for your time. He's been so wonderful to be around. His flight got canceled, and he's still braving the snow like a champ and sticking around for a little bit longer. So, Amos, we appreciate you. Thank you for your faithfulness in ministry, a preaching voice, for your thoughtfulness in dealing with a difficult text and a difficult theologian in Niebuhr and bringing those things to bear. You've given us First Pres Salisburyans much to chew on and to live into. So our job is just to keep the conversation going together. So thank you all for being here tonight. And we will be sending out the slides from earlier today from Sunday school. Also these slides as well. We've recorded this Zoom as well. If you happen to come tonight, but you didn't see worship this morning, or you didn't see the Sunday school, they really do work together in a wonderful way. And there's a lot of interesting insights that help to build along the way as well. So be sure to check out those things. And hey, we'll do it again in a year, and maybe without snow. So the Lord be with you all. The Lord bless you and keep you, and go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Take care, friends.
Thank you.
Anything